Hello, my name is Rhonda Smith, and I'm one of the artists at TAG, the Artist Gallery in Frederick, Maryland. I'd like to walk you through the design of one of my linocut prints. This is the print that I'm going to be talking about today. It's a two-panel print. There are two portions to the print. You could also call it a diptych. You might be able to just make out the line at the middle where the two panels join. So this is the finished product and the finished print. But I want to tell you where this particular print started. In March of 2020, I was in New York City going to galleries and museums and looking at art, which is one of the things I like to do a lot, because these visits to galleries and museums really do influence my work, maybe what I'm going to create, how I'm going to create it, all kinds of things. Well, in a particular gallery in Chelsea, in New York, I encountered this medieval reliquary sculpture. She's made of wood. She's probably about human size, human scale. So she was lifelike or life size. She's a reliquary because in her chest there would have been placed things, objects that would have been important sort of mementos or objects for that particular person or at that particular time. I like the idea of reliquaries. It's something that I was introduced to in African art and African culture, and this idea and notion of placing something inside a container for safekeeping, but also as a restorative or a document in some way to help the passage of time or to help a person pass through the different phases of their life's journey, including death. So the reliquary in and of itself is something that I find greatly appealing, but also this particular one. I loved her graceful face, the gestures of her hands, the two fingers pointing upward, the other hand open. It just seemed like it was such a gentle piece. I really just fell in love with it. And I took this photograph of it in the gallery. So later, when I got home, I began looking at that particular photograph over and over and thinking about the fact that I would really like to incorporate this figure into one of my linocuts. I make pieces that are about travel and excursions, and they're talismans for safe journeys. And so I often incorporate a muse, someone who is the embodiment, or a figure that is the embodiment of the things that you need in order to have a safe journey or a safe travel. And in many ways, this reliquary is also a kind of object that's hoping for safe travels through heaven, to heaven. So again, it just seemed appropriate. So I took that photograph and I printed it out and I began to play. And one of the very first things I did, because she had her hand extended in a way that seemed to me like that something could be placed in her hand, or she could be holding something in her hand. So I placed in her hand this image of a house. The image of the house is something that recurs over and over in many of my talismans for safe journeys, because many times the talisman is a way to give you a safe journey home. And this idea of a house as home, as a place that you want to return to or get to, is important in my idea of these safe journeys home. I also added, it may be a little difficult to see, but I also added in that chest cavity, in the very area where there may be something in that's been placed inside this reliquary, I drew some images, some stylized images of bleeding hearts. And I also placed around that a sort of border of little hands. Because for me, one of the things on journeys is that you always need helping hands. And so I've surrounded those bleeding hearts with helping hands. And the bleeding hearts, for me, also represent, different kinds of things. This idea of people who are compassionate, who want to help and maybe don't know how. So let's look and see what happened next. Then after that, I felt like, well, she needed a little more movement. She needed some action, something taking place that would also explain perhaps her finger, those two fingers in the air. And so the idea of a bird coming to land appealed to me. And so the goldfinch is another one of those symbolic images that brings happiness and joy. And I thought, okay, again, a good sort of symbolic message for a journey. And so I added this rather enlarged goldfinch so that it maybe is larger than the average goldfinch, but that doesn't really matter in art, right? It matters that it seemed to fit where I needed it to fit, and it worked in the way symbolically that I needed it to work. So I felt like I was probably getting really close to being ready to perhaps transfer this particular image onto my linocut plate. At this point, it's still just a printout of the photograph that I've glued on top of or drawn on top of. It hasn't been transferred yet, and it's still relatively small, 8.5 by 11 at this point. But the other thing that I like to include is a faithful companion, someone who journeys with you, who helps you in ways that you didn't expect because they're your companion, they're your friend, and a dog is that perfect companion. And so I added my own little dog right in front of this reliquary. And at the top of this particular figure, I thought, she needs a crown. She needs a crown of helping hands. And so I added a crown of helping hands because I think that she herself, as this muse, should also represent the idea of helping hands. So we just add a little crown of helping hands. And now I've also done one other thing. I've cut her out of the printout and I've placed her within a format. So the white squares behind her represent the format of my finished linocut. So she's still not to scale yet. She's still relatively small, but it helps me see what needs to happen on the final linocut for her to become a reality. And so here is our linocut, and I've transferred the image from the small printout to my linocut. So here, the two pieces of linoleum are sitting on my drafting table. The tools to actually make the cuts are to the right, my computer's to the left, because I will reference different things within this composition on my computer as I'm working, because I may decide to make changes or alterations to this piece. I don't always just cut it exactly the way I transfer it. I've also added a lot. At this point, what's been added are some willow branches at the top. Again, we need a little movement, a little more action. I've added some paper airplanes. Those are symbolic, again, of travels and journeys, and they appear in many of my talismans. And then there's some migrating birds in the background. A landscape of water, flowing water, is another element that I always like to include. And in the immediate foreground, which you can't really see in this particular image, there is sort of a conglomeration of different plant life, because you encounter all kinds of plants along your way on any journey. There's all kinds of new discoveries in flora as you travel. And so I thought it was important to add that as well. This, again, is the final piece. So this is the printed piece. Now, one of the things you'll notice from the final piece to the linoleum, the image is flipped. That's because when you print the image, it also reverses the image. So I had been looking at it just the way you'd been looking at it, with the figure on the left-hand side. But when I print it, the figure is now on the right-hand side, and the bird is flying off toward the left. And there again is the foliage, and that's the finished product. A little bit like I envisioned, and a little bit not quite like I envisioned, which is part of the joy of the process of actually making the cuts, because you do make changes within the cuts very often. Now we're going to just run a little quick video that's going to hopefully walk up to the work and get just a little bit closer, so that you can see some of the details in the finished product, in the finished print, because it's a little hard within this particular format to actually view the work in the way that you might view it if you were there in person with the piece, because you would see it from a distance perhaps, and you would walk up to it. And as you walked up to it, things would catch your attention or catch your eye, and you would be drawn to those areas. And you would look at those perhaps a little more intently until your eye took you someplace else, until a pattern or a movement began to cause you to look someplace else. And when you look down into the foliage, I added some butterflies down in there that I hadn't anticipated adding. But the idea of migrations appealed to me, and I decided I would add another element of migration with those butterflies in that final piece. And so here she is again. This is your last look at this particular piece. So I hope that one day you will get to see this finished final piece all mounted and hanging on a wall. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed looking at this creative process.